You may have seen the 1 billion damage lightning tournament runs and wondered what the heck happened to get to that point, so let's do a quick rundown of how those work. We'll start with the setup this time, since it primarily involves new characters, the oldest of which came out barely 2 months ago and won't be hitting global for another month. The big change is that the conventional approach of slow attackers stacking buffs and debuffs to maximize the efficiency of a limited number of big hits has been subverted, specifically because lightning has picked up a wide range of persisting effects that, once applied, will last for an entire fight. Combined with the base weakness increase to -200%, these make it possible to score big numbers every hit without concentrating on any single one. So we're back to a situation more like the Rose Val days, where the optimal strategy is to spam high cycle attacks, either through attackers who aren't throttled by a need for burst panels or by using multiple attackers. I personally didn't have the gear to support and speed tune multiple attackers, so I went with the former option. Going over the individual units, first we have Schea, one of the game's newest additions. She sports the new standard of 40% passives on supporters, providing 40% crit damage and break to lightning characters, which is already a sizable jump from the 20 to 30% single effect passives of yesteryear. Her other passive is 50% received item effect for the whole party, which is pretty ridiculous overall but doesn't add much to this particular sequence. In terms of persisting effects, her burst gives up to 150% crit damage to all lightning units that doesn't expire, so assuming you can get this off once, she already contributes at least 250% baseline crit damage before even considering memoria and gear. When it comes to those, there are various options, but I went with skill damage, which somehow manages to be the least stacked multiplier in this setup, and the 10-speed accessory for speed tuning. All of Shea's combat value, however, is only secondary to her actual main feature, her PMR debuff synthesis trait. The preeminent debuffer trait, this was previously thought to be limited to 1 copy per equip, since besides not having a character source, a second copy was also specifically barred from appearing on simple synthesis results. They've apparently become comfortable with allowing players to double up on this on each piece of gear, greatly increasing debuffer output, provided you can nab Schea and then hit trait 10s of the 1 in 6 combo for all your debuffer gear in the few days before the tournament ends. Taking Antze and Claudia as an example, for a single stack of her S2 debuff, going from 3 slots of PMR debuff V to 6 slots is about a multiplicative 1.5x increase in damage, obscene gains for a role that was already more or less auto-include for most setups. You do lose out a bit on the passive buff side if you were running buffet and various gear as a secondary, for lack of more useful options, but this is offset by things like the previously mentioned Schea passives. And there's more to this story that we'll get to later, but that's it for our first character. TLDR, PMR debuff synth trait, 40% crit damage and break passive, 50% item buff effect passive, permanent 150% crit damage for all lightning units on burst. Next up is Antze, stacked with her own set of unique boosts for your party. She's our third non-hitting debuffer after Brad and the OG Antze and Claudia, her S2 providing 25% lightning resistance down to all enemies for 2 hits, and then an additional persisting crit damage received debuff that goes up to 150%, without actually hitting away other debuffs itself. Crit damage received operates in the same additive category as crit damage boosts on the attacker side, so this is on par with Shea's burst, pretty good for an S2, though it does take multiple applications to max. If those 2 effects seem a bit light for a debuffer, one of her passives has you covered, granting all your lightning units a 15% one-hit damage received debuff after all attacks. That's right, she makes your other units into debuffers also. And this scales with buff effect, so you can raise this above the base 15% using things like the Halloween memoria or various supporter gear. The only downside is that this is the universal type that isn't affected by the PMR trait, but that does allow it to function for both Fizz and Magic, and still provides a decent amount of baseline damage received. Speaking of baseline, her other passive gives 20% M attack to lightning units, and her burst gives a persisting M attack buff of up to 50% to the party member with the highest M attack. There are other skill damage buffs, healing, and regen tacked onto her skills also, in case the other stuff wasn't enough, but they don't come into play much for this run. Her gear is mostly dictated by speed tuning, as even with a 0 speed accessory, she's too fast to carry memoria with 4% speed, so I went with a non-maxed Halloween memoria that boosts her M attack and party debuff effects. If you didn't get the memo, at the moment it's generally advised not to level your memoria, to leave open speed tuning options, since the only way to de-level them right now is to fuse them into new lower-level copies. But that's probably a level of min-max optimization that most people don't care about. The TLDR for Anshu, she turns all lightning units into debuffers, 20% M attack passive, permanent 50% M attack on burst, permanent 50% crit damage received S2. We won't be able to fit in the S2s for this sequence, but after the first two characters, we're at plus 250% crit damage, 70% M attack, 15% damage received, and 50% item buff effect. Plus miscellaneous memoria and equipment effects. Maybe you're beginning to see where the billion damage comes from. Our third unit is Pierce Defender Flocke, who I've included specifically for utility. Most routes don't use her, and you could easily have another passive buffer like Liddy or Wilbell, or a second attacker like Izana instead. But I like my gimmicks, and she enables us to fire off the two previously mentioned bursts sooner, which in turn buys us some room on the timeline. Flocke's main feature is that when she gets hit, while above 95% HP, she spawns a burst panel for your next earliest unit on the timeline. This effectively bypasses the various timing and startup limitations of the other burst generation methods, allowing us to burst as early as turn 2 and multiple times within the first round. The catch is that the HP threshold is quite high, and we need to balance her defense and healing a bit to have her refill to make a second panel, but also die after that. We accomplish this through grow board tuning, healing gear, and defender recovery traits. Aside from making burst panels, she has some skill damage buffs, including a persisting one on her burst that we won't be using in this, and there are some new party buff memoria options, like the defender version of Future Worth Fighting For, aka Fish, so her remaining traits will be as much buff A as we can afford. And of course, there's the speed tuning consideration, since your bursting units need to be the ones immediately following enemy attacks to receive her generated panels. TLDR Flocke brings the burst panels. You can, of course, wait for the naturally occurring panels, but you'll see the benefit of doing it this way in the actual run. That's it for our support. Next, let's move on to the offense side. The driving force here is Criselda, the second of the new standard breakers that can actually break in the current environment, and a rare example of an enemy unit whose power levels don't plummet after joining your party. She comes with the standard increased break damage, built-in weakness bonus, resistance debuffs, item gauge recharge, magic damage received debuffs, and up to 3 charges of force break. Okay, maybe a lot of that isn't quite standard, but the more interesting part of her kit is actually her unique panel generation. Upon breaking with her basic skills, she generates her exclusive book panels under all of your allies' next 2 turns. These provide a party-wide persisting 5% M attack buff, stacking up to 50%, and also a one-hit 40% skill power buff to characters who land on them. And that is indeed the same skill power that was once limited to equipment traits, then added to some Diona skills, and is now making its way into panels and memoria. 40% is a sizable amount, and this is scaled further by various received buff effects, including her own party-wide persisting 50% panel effect boost that gets activated when she breaks something with her burst. The value of these panels is high enough that the panel effect memoria are starting to see use, like the attacker one that'll come up later. Besides the panel effect buff, her burst also comes with a persisting 75% lightning damage received debuff, stacking up to 150%. On topic of memoria and debuffs, they dropped this Sophie one in a standalone banner as some kind of commemoration to the Roman tournament, so surely it was going to be a banger, and indeed, it is broken as heck. It adds a 2-hit magic damage received debuff onto all of the wearer's attacks, scaling up to 32% at rank 5, which is higher than Antze and Claudia's S2 and many other native debuffs. So you can convert any attacking character into a debuffer, or you can throw it onto a character that already has debuffs to maximize the value of their PMR debuff traits, which you can now have up to 6 copies of through Schea's gift. The permanent 150% from her burst and the pocket change from Anshu's passive aside, we have this memoria throwing another 100+% into the mix. To top it off, in an effort to make breaking relevant again, they recently increased the damage boost against broken targets, pushing Cris stocks even higher. TLDR, Boss Lady and Sophie memoria into the cart. And finally, we arrive at our damage dealer. Walter flew a bit under the radar upon release, in part because the support wasn't in place to realize his potential yet, but mostly because people, frankly, just don't like him. But here we are with this damn guy that crawled out of the Gatch Abyss while I missed Anshu and the Polar Knight memoria for a few hundred pulls, so guess we're doing this. As far as this setup goes, his main appeal is just having a high damage skill 2 that he can launch without needing to forego panel bonuses by standing on burst panels. He also gets free crits against targets with at least 5 debuffs, a condition fairly easily cleared with how much crap we're stacking. If that wasn't enough, he himself contributes another persisting 60% lightning damage received via 2 hits of his S1 and another persisting 100% magic damage received after 2 hits of his burst. His other gimmick comes in the form of more exclusive panels, his S1 spawning poison panels under enemies, the most important effect of which is to allow him to burst while he's on them. The challenge is actually getting him onto them, since again, they spawn under the enemies and they also clash with Cris, whose panels will overwrite his if she breaks something that shifts him onto them. Fortunately, we don't need his burst much beyond the initial trash clear and the 2 applications of the persisting debuff, but his panel generation does still manage to delete some useful panels over the run. Looking at the gear, most of it is the same buff effect standard that's held ground surprisingly long, with the fish sword from last summer, the more recent universal ominous bangle, and classic silver thread. The main change is the inclusion of the lightning-specific skill power trait that was introduced exclusively on the recent Christmas character. It scales up to 35%, compared to the 25% of the OG skill power, and the 30% of the skill 2 and burst variants, so provided you can get the character and remake all your gear, it does increase damage output by a decent amount. If you can't, however, there's some consolation in the new sources of skill power, namely the Cris panels that help to shift the weight away from traits. We've since gotten a character with ice skill power, and I think it's safe to say the trend of variants for specific attributes will continue. Not a fan of this kind of power creep and increased specificity, but crafting revenue is up and the game goes on. With the shift in strategy to high cycle attacking, we're dropping the Summer Promise Memoria for now in exchange for a faster 11% speed, which leaves us 2 main options that were mostly ignored until now. And first is the New Year Sale Memoria that gives a 2-hit skill damage buff on crits, a solid choice considering the balance of skill and crit damage here. And this is available from the free Memoria Selector Part 3 that Global has going right now. Clearly, I've used it so much I forgot where I put it. The second is the one I'm using here, Origin of Alchemists, with a large boost to received panel effect scaling up to 96%. and this combos especially well with the Cris panels, but does have the weakness of not doing anything if you happen to end up on a burst panel. Neither of these are things that people aimed for in the past, so just use what you have, and some other 11% without a useful effect is fine also. And that concludes the long-winded breakdown of all the different pieces. As a big disclaimer, I would hesitate to call this or anything lately meta, with how rapidly everything is developing. It's hard to say what's going to be good come the next fight, and it's already looking like this setup won't make it through the current tournament. There are safer investments like Cris, Schea, and the Sophie memoria, but there are also just a lot of pieces in general, which is how it's been lately. A constant influx of cutting-edge micro-improvements to stir people's cauldrons. Deceptively common as these setups may appear among the JP audience, that's more a sign that the rumors of the game's demise have been exaggerated, rather than a marker for the current expected standard. I finished at rank 19 with 1 billion, so it's not extremely rare but far from the norm, and people placed well with various setups, including just updated versions of the classic Izana runs. As always, play at your own pace the way you enjoy, no need to feel pressured to chase any of this, and I take no legal responsibility for any purchases you may choose to make. Now let's actually run this. Starting off, the wolf's first attack is random, so we'll need to roll it to hit Flocke. This is the main RNG for the entire run. That spawns a panel for Schea, who breaks one of the mobs as she bursts, also tagging Walter with 2-turn buff effect boost. The broken enemy staggers Walter's panels from his S1, which we'll use later. This also allows Cris to spawn her own panels in between, as she cracks the boss with her skill too. Flocke reheals for a second panel, which goes to Antze, whose burst shifts Walter onto one of his panels. The bat sends our support back to the Atelier, and Walter's first burst clears the trash from the field. And the staggering from earlier gives Cris and Walter their own respective panels after, allowing them to burst again. By Walter's second burst, we've already loaded most of our setup, so we use our buff item to collect the well-placed Cris panel, as well as a timed healing item to keep his HP up for his bonus going forward. And that's my gimmick opener. We've checked off the Schea burst, the Antze burst, both Walter bursts, 1 out of 2 Walter S1s, and 1 out of 2 Cris bursts, and evacuated all the side units in the first 11 turns. All that's left is to break once with the second Cris burst, and possibly another Walter S1 to max out all of our persisting effects. The second Cris burst gets delayed a turn because we need the S2 break to make more panels, but we check that off soon after. The rest is just alternating Cris and Walter S2s, the main trick being getting the speed right so that the wolf recovers before Cris gets another turn to re-break it. Which is actually quite tricky, especially if you insist on keeping level 1 memoria, but it mostly works out with a 4-speed accessory. The normal double S2s will hit the 100 million cap easily, and the main dips in damage are from when Cris needs to S1 for positioning, or when Walter ends up on a burst. And we don't even need items for the most part. There are some finer details, like intentionally parking the wolf on burst so it doesn't use its speed-up skills, and the damage can be a bit dangerous if it focuses one character, but we're mainly just walking. If you're still wondering when the items are coming, we're saving those for my last trick, which is to just claim the final turn for Walter by throwing a knockback item. I ran a billion timelines with paralysis procs from preserving the natural panels in the works, and this was the simplest, fail-proof way to clinch the extra hit. Well, not quite this, because Walter doesn't need the items to cap, so you would throw with Chris to roll for her damage, unlike what I did in this particular run. And there you have it, 1 billion damage. That's probably my try-hard video for the year, but I'll get some things up from time to time if the pace isn't too hectic, so stick around. There's a lot of game left. Thanks for watching.